Okay, so now we have a fun topic that our group had a lot of interesting discussions about when we wrote the paper, and it'll be presented by Dr. Van der Veen, Orthokeratology for the Prevention of Myopic Progression in Children.
Yeah. Why would I take a non-controversial topic as part of this panel? So I do want to thank my panelists, and I don't have any relevant financial disclosures or interests with regard to this topic. So Dr. Pinellas already talked a little bit about the worldwide prevalence of myopia, with over 1 billion people affected, very high prevalence in East Asian countries, 70 to 95%, much higher rates of high myopia, and that's where many of these studies for traditional and not so traditional treatments have come about. So these are really in 3 different categories: refractive treatments, pharmacologic treatments, and behavioral treatments. I get to talk about orthokeratology, or corneal reshaping, or Ortho-K for overnight lenses for myopic control. So I'm just going to put this up, and I want to talk a little bit about how this all came about historically. And Scott talked about this a little bit in the aphakic contact lens talk. So it was recognized when the PMMA lenses were used back in the 50s, they were fit with a more flat curvature than the cornea. And so when myopes were wearing these lenses and they removed it, they would have spectacle blur, because there was some reshaping of the cornea that had occurred and had partially treated their myopia. Those PMMA lenses were very uncomfortable. They helped oxygenation by creating tearing. Later, RGP lenses came about. Those were a bit better, and eventually interest in Ortho-K, or reshaping, was performed in the 60s and 70s. Those lenses still were not very comfortable. They wouldn't centrate very well, and so they kind of fell to the wayside, at least in the United States. It wasn't actually until almost the year 2000, in the 90s, when there was more interest in this corneal reshaping technology. So the first FDA lenses were only approved in 1998 and 2002. Now those were Ortho-K lenses that were approved for use mostly for adults. There was no age restriction, but the idea was that adults could now wear these lenses overnight, not have anything on in the day, and enjoy good uncorrected vision. So there are a lot of papers on Ortho-K use in adults for correction of myopia. And there was actually a safety study done in 2008 by the OTAC committee. Now, what does this have to do with children? And myopic progression will be my topic. But if you look at just how these lenses are designed now, you can see that the central part of the lens is more flat, so it causes a mild compression, this is exaggerated, of the central cornea. The different zones are created to allow it to sit and center properly on the eye and still provide good oxygenation. And then this will have some lasting effects. So if they're worn at night, the next day the lenses can come off. How does this, when I had patients come to my office wearing these Ortho-K lenses, oh, I wear my Ortho-K lenses, I'm happy. We think, why you wear an Ortho-K lens at night? Sleeping in a contact lens is a risk factor for keratitis. You can just wear a contact lens during the day. Why are you doing that? And this troubled me because I dabble a little bit in anterior segment, and I didn't like the idea of seeing a squashed cornea, and I didn't like the reflexes I was seeing. So the idea here is that by putting this lens on for myopic progression, you'll cause a peripheral myopic defocus instead of hyperopic defocus, and this somehow decreases that drive for axial elongation that we see in myopia. So this is what we're doing, and the question for this review was really, okay, you wear the Ortho-K lens for myopia, but does it actually prevent myopic progression in children? Does it actually do that? Because I hadn't seen any papers. And then what are the reported rates of myopic progression when these lenses are worn in children and adolescents? So this was our literature search, which was concluded in August of 2018. We looked just at papers that were published in English, and all of these papers had to compare use of Ortho-K to standard correction of myopia with soft contact lenses or spectacles, and they had to have a minimum of 1-year follow-up. So there were 13 articles that I read in entirety, and as did the methodologist. There was one paper that was graded as level 1 evidence. Most were level 2, and just one that was level 3. So again, I was very happy because the primary outcome was change in axial length, which you can measure, and this was done by optical biometry, so it's very precise. One paper did use ultrasound, and we kind of threw that out as not good evidence, but was included because the cycloplegic refractions were also reported, and those were, again, measured by autorefractors after cycloplegia. So I want to spend just a minute on this level 1 paper. It was very interesting, I thought. So this study recruited 32 children. They were 8 to 16 years of age. They had myopia up to 4 diopters, and they did a within-subject crossover trial. So they would wear an RGP lens in the day on one eye and the Ortho-K lens on the other eye overnight. They would measure them for 6 months, and after 6 months, they would swap eyes in terms of which eye had the type of contact lens. They also did a very good job of allowing a washout period between 2 to 3 weeks before they switched over the type of treatment. So here on this graph, which was, I think, the main outcome from this paper, I want to draw your attention to the light gray lines, which is the gas-permeable eye here in the first 6 months, and here in the second 6 months. And what you'll see that at all time points, the eye that was wearing the gas-permeable eye had a progression in myopia. Now on the left, you see axial length measures. It's not a big change, but it was a progression. If you look at the Ortho-K eye in the darker line, you see there's a little shortening of the axial length from the compression of the cornea. And when that lens was discontinued and the washout period, it basically went back to baseline in terms of axial length here. And similarly, this is the new baseline because we've swapped eyes, a little compression, discontinue the lens, and it returns to baseline. Okay? So that was only a statistically significant difference after 6 months at each time point. So what about the actual numbers, what was happening? So these are sort of some takeaway points from this study. Gas-permeable eye showed progression, axial elongation at all time points, 0.05 millimeters plus or minus 0.09. That's not a lot, it's a little bit. And in the second group, what was interesting here, remember these eyes swapped. So the second 6-month period, the eye that had been wearing the Ortho-K is now wearing RGP. It had twice as much axial elongation. This led the authors to question, is there a rebound effect if you wear one for a bit and then you discontinue it and go to another mode of correction, which here was the RGP lens. Only a significant difference after 6 months, and the cycloplegic refraction changes did match the change in axial length, which was about 0.4 diopters more myopia in the RGP eyes. So I'm just going to put these up quickly because the other studies that were well-designed, randomized, or even not randomized, where the parents chose the mode of correction, they were usually followed a bit longer for 2 years, but they had similar findings. So this paper, difference in axial length, 0.36 versus 0.63. You can see the standard deviations are pretty large for that amount. This paper, same idea, 0.2, 0.5 after 2 years. Same in the consecutive case series, 0.3 and 0.64. In these papers, there were a couple of things that were interesting. One is if you start sooner, kids under 8, so the studies went down to 5 or 6, up to 16. Kids under 8 or 9 had a greater effect, and interestingly, with a larger pupil, there was a greater effect in Ortho-K eyes. Cycloplegic refractions, this was the biggest study that was more multi-ethnic, and this was Ortho-K, myopic shift of 0.12 after 3 years versus 1 diopter with soft contact lenses. Now, limitations of these studies, again, there's a high bias toward Asian ethnicities. So we don't really know if this would be the same effect for Caucasian, African American, Hispanic, et cetera. Some of the studies weren't randomized, not great design, small sample sizes, and importantly, high dropout rates, about 25% in all of them. The Ortho-K groups were, the fittings were done by certified examiners and they followed the patients very closely. So if they didn't fit properly and had too much staining early on, they were excluded and taken out of the study. If they weren't compliant, they were taken out of the study. In the other groups, and so they dropped out pretty early. The control groups dropped out later, and in these East Asian populations, usually it was because parents were anxious about progression and they didn't want to be in the control group. They wanted to seek out a different treatment. The other things, though, that we thought about, there are some other limitations, which is that statistically significant differences may not meet a clinically significant difference. And there was a high variation from individual to individual with those high standard deviations. There's no real-life cost comparison in any of these papers, so Ortho-K is much more expensive than a pair of single-vision spectacles or even soft contact lenses. And one of the main concerns here is that there weren't severe adverse events reported, but a clinical trial represents the best case scenario. So I have to say a couple things about microbial keratitis briefly. One is that the Ortho-K safety paper was published 10 years ago. This was in adults, and it's a low rate of infection in that group. Pediatric studies, we know microbial keratitis is associated with contact lens wear. So if you're wearing a contact of any type, you're going to have a higher rate of microbial keratitis, kind of like my cell-soft lenses. In the papers and case reports about really bad adverse events, it's usually from acanthamoeba or Pseudomonas. Most of those early reports were because of poor hygiene and poor fit, and so hopefully that has improved over the decades with certified people being trained to fit these and also better patient education. Future studies, just quickly, better safety data, we really need that, comparing other overnight contact lenses in children to these Ortho-K lenses. What's the best age to institute treatment? Probably earlier in the myopia course, not after it's already happened. How long should we treat? Because the eye is growing for a while. So is it really 2 years or is it 5 years? And is there a rebound when you discontinue it? And then finally, is there a synergistic effect of atropine and Ortho-K? There are some studies going on now, just the reports are starting to come out that there may be a combination effect. Conclusions, you should draw your own. This is not a report that is for or against Ortho-K. The goal is to provide information so that when people come, you have some of the tools you may need to help them make their own decision.